we want to take a few minutes and just talk about a few things that we thought were interesting. Pastor Rick's sermon today, it was absolutely a good sermon, and I've got a few thoughts, and I think Toby might have a few thoughts too. So we just thought we'd banter about it a little bit. So Toby, we obviously picked up in Matthew chapter 5, and Pastor Rick went into verse 3. It says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Certainly there's a lot of takeaways there. Was there anything that struck you particularly?
Yeah, Jeff, one thing that I never knew is that Jesus isn't specifically talking to being financially poor. He's talking about having a spiritual need for Jesus. And that was just a fun fact that I enjoyed learning. And then pairing it with the ending of Pastor Rick's message, which was, he had that illustration of walking through a front door and being recognized. And the thought crossed my mind of, we don't really recognize Jesus wanting to walk through the front door that often. Before we started, you had pointed out that Jesus isn't speaking to people who didn't know the Hebrew text. He's speaking to the Jews. So that there's a common knowledge of the Bible, which I think for most of the people watching at home kind of fit into that category of they have some knowledge of who God is, but we don't really recognize who God is. Do you know what Ring is? It's the little doorbell app. I think sometimes we like to think that we have a Ring app where we can see Jesus at the front door, but we usually don't invite him in and recognize that he's standing at that front door. And so those were some of the initial takeaways I had from this week's message. How about
that's
you?
a great point. I didn't think of the Ring app. You're absolutely right, though. Well, and again, you're spot on. It's not my impression at all that Jesus is talking to necessarily the crowds that have not chosen to follow him. These are believers. And people mention the Beatitudes, and to me, I categorize it, these are attitudes that we should be. We should be these attitudes. And granted, Pastor Rick just hit verse 3, but if we go through it, and we will in future weeks, we're going to see this thing kind of blossom and unfold, if you will. One thing that I was looking at and I thought was interesting was there's a rhyme and a reason and a certain trajectory to the order that Jesus mentions these in. For instance, he starts with verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." You, by the very nature of being poor in spirit, you have to attain that position before you can get to verse 4, "Blessed are those who mourn," or "Blessed are the meek," or "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." In that, if you don't first start with being poor in spirit, you can go nowhere. That is foundational. You're going nowhere in your spiritual life, you and I as well, unless we first admit that we have nothing. And again, I think Jesus was the master of the juxtaposition. And we read poor in spirit, and Pastor Rick rightly said it wasn't a financial term, but it meant your position in the spirit. Jesus other times said, "Unless you hate your mother and father, you cannot follow me." And I'm paraphrasing. Well, certainly he didn't mean to hate your mother and father. It was in relationship to the love you had for him that anything other than that would be tantamount to hate. So it's the same thing here. It's a juxtaposition. Blessed are the poor in spirit. I believe he's speaking, you do not want to be haughty, proud, like, hey, I got to where I'm at, all my hard work, all my Bible study, all I give at church, all I do this. No, you got to realize you have nothing, absolutely nothing. And actually having nothing is ground zero where we all have to start. God gives it. It's a total blessing by him.
That's a great point of having absolutely nothing. That brings to mind, we've been going through in our men's study Genesis, now we're in Exodus,
Yes.
but I was just reminded of the story of Joseph and how he was someone who started out haughty. Of the Lord had these blessings, but being a young man and being the younger of his brothers, he had an arrogance about the way that he shared what the Lord was doing in his life.
Yeah.
And so the Lord had to humble him so that he could then see the Lord do a mighty thing in his life. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that's something the Lord's speaking to other people when they hear this message. It's something that the Lord's bringing to my mind is what you just said is a need to recognize without God, we have nothing. And that being poor in spirit is recognizing we have a need for God. And once we recognize that he needs to walk through that front door of our life and be a part of it, that's when we're going to see him do those great things.
Absolutely. And I'm not saying it's an easy place to get to, and I like your reference to Joseph, because by nature, I think we do tend to have, I earned this type attitude. And I'm not saying that's completely wrong as a work ethic in the workplace, but when it comes to spiritual issues, we have no idea. Either God gives it or he doesn't. And I think the end of that verse, for theirs is a kingdom of heaven, to me, and if I springboard off what you say, if this gift of the kingdom of heaven truly is something God gives if we're poor in spirit, obviously it is a true gift. We don't earn that. So I think it fits with the rest of the Beatitudes. And honestly, I can't wait to get through the rest of them. I mean, we could probably spend the next 20 minutes talking about this, but I'm really anxious to get to the rest of them.
Yeah. And even just a question of how do you think we can kind of get to that posture of being needy, recognizing and acting on our need for Jesus?
Well, and I know that everybody's mind right now is on the current condition that we have going on with the COVID-19. And I'll tell you, it has humbled me. I've actually been able to use that in a form, fashion, or shape to recognize my inability to control things. And I think there's a spiritual crossover there. I really do. But anyway, speaking of that, let's kind of wrap this up. Toby, do you have something you want to leave with our friends at home?
Yeah, friends, just wonderful church family. We just jump into the Beatitudes. This whole passage in Matthew is such a sweet passage of the Bible, where I believe it's 3 chapters of Jesus is giving this Sermon on the Mount. And it's really such a hopeful message. The Beatitudes are, this is what you receive from God. And he goes in to talk about the power of who God is and his relationship with the Lord. And I think it's a sweet reminder for us as we go through just this season of life with the COVID-19 to recognize that God's looking out for us and he has a blessing he wants to give to us. And we're going to see what those are as we continue our study in the Beatitudes.
I think that's really good. I have really come to realize that we see what we look at. And although we do have a lot of adverse circumstances right now, some of you are church history buffs or just regular history buffs, and you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. You remember in 1350, 1351, the Black Plague hit Europe and actually decimated millions of people. And it was a tragedy. But what followed that? That was during the Dark Ages. What followed that was the Enlightenment, or we call it the Renaissance period, if you will. And spiritually, that's when the Reformation took place. And there's church historians for sure, but there's secular historians that will tell you, had that Black Death, that plague, not hit, the Reformation and the church expansion and growth might have been put off by hundreds of years. All I'm saying with this, God is going to do something wonderful with this. Keep your eyes on the Lord and you watch what's going to happen. It's going to be good, I'll promise you that.